Watering the garden is probably one of the most important needs of our garden plants, and also one of the garden tasks that can quickly get really old. But the idea of setting up a drip irrigation system can be confusing at best, downright impossible feeling at worst. In today's episode, we're going to walk through my garden and talk about how I've set up my DIY drip irrigation system, as well as give you the tools you'll need to create an irrigation system of your own. Welcome to the Garden Things with Friends podcast. We're here to show that building a thriving garden is possible for everyone, even those with busy schedules and long to-do lists. I'm Ashley, your host, and 2 years ago, I turned my garden dreams into reality in my suburban backyard. Through trial and error over the next 2 seasons, I've created a thriving garden that I absolutely love. My goal is to inspire you to create your dream garden too. So let's grow together. Hey guys, and welcome to my garden and the podcast. This episode is a little different because I'm coming to you straight from my backyard. I'll be showing you in real time what my drip irrigation system looks like. So if you're listening to the podcast, be sure to check out the video version on YouTube. The goal of today's podcast episode is to empower home gardeners to set up their system and check watering off their garden to-do list for good. So just so that we are all on the same page, let's get a quick definition of drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is a way of watering your garden where the water is slowly delivered to the level of your soil for the garden plants over time, allowing the plant roots to use much more of the water that is delivered. There are a ton of benefits for adding a drip system to your garden, and those benefits are going to include enhanced water efficiency. You're not going to be paying as much on your water bills. You're not going to be spending as much time watering. You're not going to have as much splashback onto the leaves, and this is going to lower the spread of soil-borne pathogens to your plants, and you're not going to have as much runoff and evaporation. And these benefits can really help you see success in your garden, no matter whether you are growing in a small space or have a larger garden space. So when it comes to creating a simple irrigation system for your vegetable garden, you do have quite a few options to choose from. Now, as you can see, I grow mostly in raised garden beds and container gardens. So all of my experience is going to come from this type of gardening. As I talk about each option for your drip system, I'm going to show you how they're being used in my own garden and garden space. Now, you can easily create a simple irrigation system using soaker hoses. And a soaker hose system simply requires you to connect your main garden hose to soaker hoses or drip tape, and that's going to be snaked throughout your garden bed. This system requires very little work and can be used for a small garden or in-ground flower beds, like those that you'll often see in the front yard. Because the drip lines are connected directly to the garden hose, however, you could find some uneven watering, especially the closer you get to the end of the drip tape. Now, I am not using this method in my garden this year. I did use a form of drip tape last year in my raised beds, but I've changed all of my beds to a method I'm going to talk about in a bit. Another simple method of passively watering your garden is to use oyas. Oyas are unglazed terracotta pots that you can bury in your garden. And as you fill them up with water from the top, they slowly seep out water into the soil. And if you were to dig up around the oyas at the end of the season, you'll notice that the roots of your plants kind of grow towards the oyas. Now, I'm going to be placing oyas in 2 of my garden beds this year. I'm going to put them in my herb bed as well as my medicinal flower garden. And these 2 should have pretty minimal watering requirements, so I feel they're a really great way to try out this ancient technique. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this method for a very large garden bed, especially if you want to have drip irrigation as a time-saving method, because filling the oyas up over many garden beds can be really time-consuming. So if you have a large garden, maybe try a different method. Now, another option you can use for your drip irrigation system is a drip irrigation kit, or you can DIY your own kit. And this is what I used last year. And it worked really great for most of my plants. It did require a bit of trial and error. There isn't a lot of information out there about how to actually build the system, so you just have to start connecting pieces and see what works. Now, some of the issues that I ran into with this method was pretty uneven watering the further from the emitter tubing I got. And this meant that some of my plants, specifically my fruiting plants, didn't get the deep watering that they needed to thrive. And then the further I got from the water source at my faucet, the lower the water pressure was. So the last method of setting up your drip irrigation system is by far the easiest, and it's what I have transitioned all of my beds to. And that is the Garden in Minutes garden grids. Now, when I renovated my garden this year and moved the beds to the southeast corner of my yard, I knew I was going to need drip irrigation that gave me a much more even watering. And since my garden was going to be further from the watering source, I wanted to make sure that the water delivery was consistent. The Garden in Minutes garden grids checked off all of those boxes and some that I didn't even know I needed checking, like following a square foot gardening method of fabrication. And this makes watering individual plants so much more effective, and it really keeps my chaos gardening tendencies in check. All right, so at this point, we know why we want to have a drip irrigation system, and we've decided on the type of system we want. So let's talk about how to practically put this together. And I want to note here that you may want to check out this episode on YouTube because it's going to allow you to visually see what I'm going to be talking about next. So the first thing you want to do when you're creating your irrigation system is to map out your space. I like to do this on graph paper, and I'm just going to draw out exactly where everything is in my garden, as well as where my water source is. You want to make sure that you also have the measurements of distances between the beds and from your water source. And this distance can change how you distribute water to your garden, as well as how many different zones you want to set up. And a zone is just the area that a particular system will be distributing water to. In my garden, I have 3 different zones. One goes to my raised beds, one goes to my containers and my main greenstock garden, and one goes to my berry patch greenstocks and containers. And you want to keep in mind that the more beds you're distributing to, the less water that's going to go to each bed or container, which means you'd have to water for longer. I like to try to evenly distribute the square footage that each zone is covering, and that's why I have 3 zones in my garden. Once your garden is mapped out, you can draw out, probably in pencil, what drip irrigation will look like in your garden. And this is quite simple with the Garden in Minutes garden grids because they have a ton of configurations based on the size of your garden beds. So for my garden, I'll simply list out the sizes of each bed. So all I really need to do is to draw out my delivery tubings and connection fittings. Now it's time to create your drip irrigation supply list and head to the hardware store or online. Some supplies that you're going to need include a faucet splitter, a pressure regulator, which will decrease the pressure from 50 psi to 25 psi, hose converters that allow you to connect your faucet timing to the drip irrigation tubing. You're going to need a system timer. Now, this is optional, but this truly removes watering from your to-do list. You'll want a backflow preventer, a water filter, and then some sort of hole punch to put holes in your tubing. Now, depending on your setup, specifically if you are DIYing an irrigation kit, you'll need various fittings, connectors, emitters, and tubing, both mainline and micro tubing. To determine exactly what you'll need, you want to make sure you've walked through mapping your garden specifically. And if that is still confusing, at the end of the episode, I'll be sharing a limited time service I'm going to be offering to help you build your specific irrigation system. And I've also created a free drip irrigation printable guide that you can take with you to the supply store. It's a PDF form and includes links to many of my online recommendations. And you can get a copy of that in the show notes below. With our supplies ready, it's time to set up our systems. Now I have a 4-way splitter on my garden faucet, and this allows me to run water to each of my 3 zones, as well as have a regular hose available for spot watering and filling my oyas. To set up your water supply, you'll connect your faucet splitter to the water source and then add on a backflow preventer. Now, this is important because it helps to keep the water in your irrigation system from flowing back into your main household water supply. My timer has a backflow preventer incorporated, so I don't have that particular part on my system. And I really like these beehive timers, which are Bluetooth and Wi-Fi enabled, so I can water from anywhere. Then you can add additional filters. Again, my timer includes that as well, so I don't add an additional one. From there, you'll add on a pressure regulator, which will decrease pressure from 50 psi to 25 psi, as well as a line converter, which connects to your 1/2-inch distribution tubing. The next thing I do is set up my garden beds. And with Garden in Minutes garden grids, this was as simple as connecting a few main sections and laying the grid in my bed. Now, I'll admit, when I ordered slightly on the larger side. These grids are created right on the foot measurement, and many garden beds have odd measurements. This system does create their own garden beds as well, which can help decrease the overhang you experience when using these grids with other companies' raised beds. And I'm also going to note that if you're using these with a raised bed that has rounded corners, Garden in Minutes garden grids give you the option to order cornerless grids. Now, you can check out these grids and get 7% off discount by clicking the link in the show notes and using the codes GARDENTHINGS at checkout. Now that the water source and the beds are set up, we'll run our line to our garden beds. Now, I initially ran my distribution line out as I needed to run it and then added the 1/2-inch closure at the end. I use a combination of T and L fittings to connect my garden beds to my distribution tubing. At this point, I like to test my setup to make sure that everything runs adequately and get an idea for how long the system needs to run for even watering. For my beds currently, I run this zone every other day for about 10 minutes. After testing, you can set up your timer and truly enjoy hands-free watering. Now, I do want to note a few tips for making sure your system works for you all season long. And the first is to monitor your timing as the season progresses and your plants mature. In the heat of the summer, additional watering may be necessary. I typically water daily in the summer to maintain proper moisture. Additionally, watering early in the morning or later in the evening can ensure the water gets to the root zone. Afternoon watering is not ideal. Lastly, be sure to check your system regularly for any leaks or issues. Fixing these early can save you time and water in the long run. With a properly set up drip irrigation system, you can enjoy less time hand watering and more time tending to your plants and enjoying your garden. And with the ability to easily expand and customize your system, it's a great investment. Now, I know this episode was a ton of information, and I hope it has been helpful in guiding you through creating your own drip system. But inevitably, listening or watching isn't always enough. So I want to remind you of the free irrigation guide I created, which is linked in the show notes. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, I will be offering a service this season for those who would like more personal guidance on setting up your system. With this consultation, we'll do a virtual walkthrough of your garden, talk through watering requirements of your plants, and I'll do the planning for you. I'll list exactly what you'll need, where to purchase, as well as do a follow-up meeting for any additional questions you may have. And if this service is something you'd be interested in, you can learn more and fill out the form in our show notes, and I'll get you scheduled. All right, y'all, that is it for today's episode. This has been a lot of fun, and let me know in the comments if you'd like this format. I'd love to plan more episodes where we're in the garden doing the garden things in real time. Now, if you dug this episode, I'd be honored if you'd rate this podcast and spread the word to your friends who are also passionate about gardening. Your 5-star support fuels the growth of Garden Things with Friends, and together we'll cultivate a network of thriving gardens and plant-loving friends. Happy gardening, and remember, it's never the wrong